Hi guys, my name is Christina and welcome to my channel. And on this channel we talk a lot about how to create comics, and I'm sharing everything I've learned after creating my own comic for more than 6 years. But we also talk about art, how to create art, how to enjoy creating art, and how to do art professionally and earn money with your art. If any of this is interesting to you, there's things you can do down below to help the channel, and channel in turn I hope can help you. In this video I decided I'm gonna talk to you about why I abandoned my novel. So for some of you who are new to my channel, you might not know the whole story, and I have a couple of videos explaining it. I'm gonna be linking them over here. But basically, in a nutshell, the premise is I was writing a novel before. I published one novel and then I was writing part 2, and then eventually I switched my novel to a comic and completely abandoned writing and creating novel as it is. So I decided, like, I have the whole story mentioned in the video that is pretty old, like for my YouTube lifetime, which is like 1 year old. It is, as an old video, supposed to be very awkward and in shitty quality, but the sound is good and tells you the story. But in short terms, my story was originally a comic. I was not as good as a writer back then because I was a teenager, and I slowly transitioned into writing, just was playing around with it, and then got into it seriously, wrote a novel, published a novel, started writing another novel, and then eventually transitioned my whole story to the comic again. And basically my comic right now is me retelling the novel, or at least retelling part 1 of the novel and somewhat retelling part 2, and then finishing it with part 3. Novels will transition into volumes or arcs of the comic. So that's it in a nutshell. And I just recently made several videos talking about just writing, what I miss being a writer, and the difference between being an artist and being a writer. And I started thinking more and more about it, and I decided to talk overall during one video about why I abandoned the novel writing of my comic. And because there are several reasons. Yeah, I decided to just talk to you about this because this is something that can happen in, artistic sphere, and I wanted to, just share my story. So this is gonna be like more story time, just talking, no like chapters, no, subtitles of what I'm like talking about. I'm just gonna talk about it. I think it's important to start, first of all, how, like, just to little repeat myself what I talked in the video that I mentioned prior, is that my comic originally was a comic. I started it as a comic, but the reason why I stopped creating it as a comic is exactly because I was not as good of a writer. I didn't know how to produce vast quantities of the pages in a short amount of time, and I was producing pages so slowly, and they were drawing in pencil, and it would be good to show you some of those pages, but A, they're terrifying. I don't want to show it to anybody, and 2 is because I actually don't have access to them. They're somewhere back in Russia in some storage. It took me so much time to create them, so I realized it's just impossible. It's not gonna happen. I can never tell the whole story, and I realized the story is so much bigger. And at the same time, I had a tutor in Russian language, and my tutor happened to be an editor, a professional editor. So as I was working with her, she kind of realized that I'm writing here and there, and then it slowly transitioned into me actually starting writing a novel and her editing it as we go. I originally started as just a good practice for me because I was a little bit dyslexic, so that's why I had a tutor, because she was helping me to just extra pushing grammar and everything inside my brain, that it was I was counterbalancing whatever weird stuff was happening in my head as I was writing. But as I was starting doing this, it's quickly became something serious, and my editor started teaching me a lot about writing overall. And already, because I was kind of writing here and there, I was a creative kid, eventually it became a novel. And then over the course of several years I wrote it, and I started part 2, and I got really into it, and I really like it. It was not amateur stuff anymore. I was writing novels, and I was writing, and I knew how to write. I had a very good grasp on language, on all the ways how you can use language in artistic way and like writing way. But eventually I stopped doing that. Let's talk why. 5 minutes into the footage. Couple things. And actually, this moment of me, how I transitioned from working on a novel to completely going back to a comic again, a lot of what I learned during this time I'm using to help you when I'm talking about, what do if you're stuck, what do if you're not motivated, what do if you don't have inspiration, and those type of videos actually referring into this moment, because this is where I kind of started struggling with those things. But let's name several reasons in no particular order. So several things were happening at the same time. First of all, this is where I started my account on DeviantArt, started growing. Back back in the days when DeviantArt was a big thing, I started getting a lot of views, I started getting a lot of people commenting. I basically started growing there in my like art endeavors and started to be more known as an artist. And this has coincided with the fact that I started drawing digitally. Before I was drawing traditionally, and originally when I was creating my comic, it was traditional, it was drawn in pencil and full shading, and it took forever. But then I got introduced to digital art, and that completely changed the game for me. I full on, you know, jumped and drowned in the digital art area of art, and I realized that in digital art you can draw way faster. It's very accessible. You don't have all these tools, because every time I would draw traditional, I'll have all these tools running around, and it was like a great mess, especially if you're drawing in pencil. You have like a sharpener, I had like a special place to sharpen into, I had a lot of pages, I had like some books that I was referring to, like anatomy books and whatnot. I had something heavy when I would put my piece of paper on, and I had a folder with my previous pages that I had to cross-reference. But with digital, you just need your computer, and that's all you need. And I started to really love digital art and draw a lot. And I'm very, you know, simple person. If I write my story, this is what I'm thinking about, and as I'm drawing, most of the time I just want to draw my story. I'm very focused at what I do, and that's why I started drawing scenes from my novel, and I started posting them. So I use my novel as a subject of me practicing and drawing digitally, and I started posting it on DeviantArt. This is when DeviantArt, like my account started growing in DeviantArt, it attracted a lot of people, and naturally people started asking, what is that? So what happened is that even though by this time actually first part of my novel one, book one, was published, I started getting more reaction from people and hearing from people reacting to my illustration rather than to my novel, because I publish it traditionally, and it's kind of like this weird feeling like you publish, you send it into the void, and you never hear about like from your readers. And this is something that I actually didn't like, because I created something, I sent it off, and nothing happened. Like, I mean, people talk on forums, I would Google myself, you know, I just wanted to hear what people are feeling and thinking about the story I'm creating. And I wanted to hear, not necessarily a feedback, like a discussion, I just wanted to hear from people who read it. And this wasn't happening in this sense. Like, I would go and I see some reviews, and Russia is, it's a little harsh place. People usually don't like to stop by and write positive comments. They like, if they're stopping by to write a comment, it's gonna be negative comment, and it's gonna be like, this book is not for them. To be fair though, my novel was a middle grade story back then, and if some adults would read it, they might necessarily vibe with the tone, and it makes sense. And the tone made sense for me because I was a younger person back then. But the people who actually, you know, who the story was for, I didn't hear back at that point in time. I started hearing them later. I cannot mention them later, but what happened is that I was working so hard at creating this world, and I sent the story out and I hear nothing, crickets, just because of the way how it works. And this is not fun. I like engaging with my audience and people I write for. I write for them, why I can't hear from them? That's so sad. When I was starting posting my art and started drawing digital scenes from my comics, people will be commenting and asking, what's that? What's the story is about? Who is this character? They appear in several of your drawings. Is it the story where I can read it? And people started getting really engaged and really interested in the material as I was, you know, drawing those illustrations. And this I really liked. And I started talking to people about this. Like, mention, okay, this isn't this character. And then next time I would draw some scene from my novel, I would make sure you can kind of understand some plot through this scene. And at the same time, I was writing book two. So this is what was happening in my illustration aspect. There was a lot of interest coming from there, and people were asking me about the story, and people were talking about my story, and they were kind of starting to figure out the plot a little bit. Something that I want to add really quickly here, I don't think I mentioned it, is that on the DeviantArt, I actually was speaking English and was posting in English, and people I got interest from were English-speaking people, and my novel was in Russian. So I couldn't just refer them to the novel because they wouldn't be able to understand it. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. And I loved it, and I loved talking to them about this, and I started having people who are coming back and commenting again, and people started to get to know names of the character, because I would literally name the painting certain way. Like, if this is a portrait of the character, I would name it as the character's name would be. I really enjoyed that. At the same time, as I was writing book two, I was thinking, I wish I could talk about this with someone, and I had a couple writer friends that, you know, I would exchange chapters with, and I would get feedback from them, but it was just one person, just two people, and it wasn't enough. Like, you know, to me personally, like, again, each artist, each author, each writer their own, but to me, I'm spending hours every day writing the story, immersed into this world, and it feels like I'm only writing for 2 people, you know? Like I get feedback only for 2 people. It doesn't matter what feedback even is. It's like, you know, if you're saying something, imagine you having a conversation, you know, sitting in a group of people and you're saying some thoughts like that you have, and everybody just says nothing, you know? It's like, that's when you, to me, if I'm uttering something, if I'm putting something out there, I want to see what people think about it, how they engage with the content and whatnot. It started feeling to me a little bit unsatisfying. It's like I almost wanted to focus more on drawing scenes from my story rather than writing scenes from my story, because one, I actually can talk to my audience and actually see who I'm creating for. With writing, I couldn't. And another thing started to happen as well. As I mentioned, my novel originally, like the part 1, was a middle grade type of level, because just the age that I was back then. And this, I think it is overall the challenge for someone who is a writer, who is a young writer. You're starting writing really young, and there is a huge, you know, mental shift that is happening before you hit your early 20s. That's like, you literally, your brain develops. This is not something that you learn more about life. It's like something happens with your goddamn brain and psyche, and you're getting things differently. It's kind of tricky thing, because you are, you know, you are a writer and you want to write stories, but at the same time you grow up so fast, because every year, every day, as you're going through, you know, the time probably maybe from your 15-year-old to, you know, 21, 22 years old, it's something changes completely in your world perception. Like you really grow up, and because this is such a small period of time, you change very fast. The change that happens during 1 year is huge. And I think it's a good example. I really related to this author, by the way, like as I was writing, you know, well known Christopher Paolini and his whole inheritance cycle. And I remember reading the first book, and I learned that this guy wrote it when he was 15. Well, this was published when he was 15 or something like this. And I related, because this was around the time when I wrote my story. And I related also to the fact, as I was reading his books, you can see that he's changing mentally as a person. And if his original book was kind of him grabbing pieces from everywhere, and the way, like the tone almost of the book kind of started changing a little bit, and I could feel, as I was reading his books, I was feeling kind of the same struggle that I was going through as you grow up, but the story that you set up might be not, you know, meant to be growing up with you. And, you know, I don't know if it makes sense, but in my experience, I set up to write one story, and then by the time I was writing book 2, part 2, I was every day, as I was almost working on it, I was starting to feeling very strange. I felt stuck. This is the first time I experienced being stuck, having writer's block. And it's almost like no matter what I write, it just doesn't feel right. Whatever I do, it doesn't feel right. To me in particular, what was happening is that I grew up as a person, and part 2 was having different tone completely to book 1. And I noticed that in book 2, I kind of almost had to fight with book 1, and I had to almost rewrite certain things with book 1, like in a way that I could add more context to what happened. And it kind of works somewhat, because book 1 is told from the perspective of a teenage character from Sakai. She is 16 years old, she's turned 16, 17. And the book 2 was from Kuroi's perspective, and he is in his early 20s. So, and he is a little bit different character. He's more mature already, and he also older by years. So writing book 2 from his perspective, it's kind of was an excuse for me to have a different tone for this book, a little bit more mature, a little bit more logical, a little bit more calm down, less angsty. Also, you know, because he is a guy, and man, they do have different way of thinking that I try to understand as well. Women are more empathetic, they more understand things through feelings first, while men tend to understand through logic first. And I'm not saying that, you know, I know like internet is a little sensitive, I'm not saying, you know, women are all emotions and guys are all logic and emotionless, but there is a tendency of how people focus on things and how they gather information, how they assess situations. There's a lot of different things, and, you know, men and women are different in this regard. There's definitely this something in mentality. I can make a whole lot of video of how, you know, societal condition adds up to how we mentally develop, kind of we embody what we're supposed to be, what people say our gender is supposed to be. But this is another can of worms, topic for another time. Overall, I was able to kind of write the story in a different tone and focus on a more darker themes, on a more serious themes, on a more complex things, on a more like gray areas through his character. And also he's a more gray type of character. Sakai is more of a straightforward, and he's conflicted soul, okay? He's like going through it. He is a good vessel to, you know, go through this more complex themes. And also as we're going deeper into the story becomes darker. However, it's still, no matter what of those excuses were that I could use to kind of justify the change of tone, the change of what story is focusing on and whatnot, it still was a huge discrepancy between book 1 and book 2, and it felt at some point I couldn't write book 2 further because it was so... I couldn't be true to book 2 and book 1 at the same time. If I stay true to book 2, to the tone, to the kind of the plot dynamic, to overall atmosphere and vibe and themes of book 2, it would be in conflict with book 1. But if I try to be true to themes and the vibe and overall atmosphere from book 1, it would be in conflict with book 2. It took me some time to realize that basically I'm a different writer now. I'm interested in different things, and the story, if I want to write the very same story, book 1 doesn't work with book 2, I have to rewrite book 1 technically, or I have to go and make book 2 different. One of the books had to go or has to be changed. And as I was struggling with that, like I didn't yet realize that this is the problem that I've been having. Also, during this time, I started dabbling in comics again. Because, you know, I had creative problems with this particular project, and that's why I started working on another one in a comic form. I thought, well, I don't want to write another story because they're gonna be fighting for my attention, those two stories. But if I create it in different media, probably it won't. So I started working on the comic that's called Emerald Beads. I really love it. I really love the story. I'm gonna finish it one day. But I started developing it, and I realized I couldn't have my eyes on both projects at the same time, no matter what the media. And I started slowly feeling like I wanna work on this project more and more. That made me feel worse because my true soul and like my true passion is in the Book of Contradiction. I feel like this is the story I want to tell first. I want to tell it. I cannot abandon it. It was very conflicting times, and I decided, well, maybe I should start writing the Book of Contradictions in a comic form on this side. As I'm writing it as a novel, I might start it as a comic, and in this way I kind of start retelling book 1. And at the same time, people who have been asking me online about what these illustrations are for, I can give them a comic and say, hey, check this comic out. This is actually what you've been asking about. This is the story in comic form. And I made a post, did a poll, and say, hey guys, would you be interested in reading a comic about all those illustrations that you've been seeing? And everybody's like, yeah. So I felt encouraged, and I decided to give it a go, do a test, start it. And I thought maybe this way it will help me because I will be still in the world of the story, but I will be in a different media. So maybe doing that will still keep me thinking about the story and make me, you know, fix whatever is happening in my head. Back then I didn't understand what happened. I thought I had a writer's block. So I started working on the comic. And as I started working on the comic, I quickly realized it's like kind of my second chance. I can almost rewrite the story a little bit. I can create the story with a different tone a little bit and go over the plot of book 1, change it a little bit as now I want my story to be. Made the story grow up a little bit and make the story already darker, and I started making some changes to the way the story was told. And as I started doing this, I just felt a lot of enthusiasm. It felt like, yeah, I can write my story again. Also, however, I was apprehensive that I'm kind of rewriting the story again, but I felt like in a comic form it's easier to do because it's so different that it almost feels like a new project, as while it's not. And at the same time, the majority, like the writing is done, I just have to adapt it, retell it a little bit. So it's not a lot of plotting was going on, and it was just easier. You know, I just already had the idea. I just have to polish it and rewrite it. Basically saying draft 1, draft 3, and then draft 4, draft 5, kind of like you creating new draft of the story. At the same time, I was moving to Canada. And as I was moving to Canada, and obviously I was practicing my English quite a lot, and comic actually was in English, because another thing that is important to mention is that as I was posting on DeviantArt, the whole conversation, everything was happening in English. I was talking to people in English, I was talking to people from English-speaking countries, or at least with people who knew English. It also contributed to me actually enjoying creating the comic because I was able to practice my English as I was doing it. And at the same time, I was preparing to go to Canada, and I was practicing my English a lot, I was working on my comic, and I started to feel a little bit of contradiction here again, because I was spending so much time speaking, listening to, consuming English anything, and, trying to speak more English, because I really didn't want to be that type of immigrant who comes to the country and they have very thick accent and they don't put enough of effort to speak good English, I was really trying to make my English sound good, I was really practicing a lot, and at the same time, I was still very deep in, writing the story in Russian as I was writing a novel. Then eventually I moved, and this is where I think complete switch happened, because since I moved and I almost didn't write, I stopped writing the novel almost natural, not on purpose. I just noticed that I'm not picking up my laptop a lot. More often than not, I go and I write my comic on my computer, like a desktop. I started, every time I would open my laptop to work on my novel, I would open it up and it would be in Russian. And it would really, first, because at least for me, what I noticed, when you're becoming really good in different language and you are really immersed into this language surroundings, like everybody is using this language, talking to this language, it's harder to switch between the languages. Like, you're not as good yet that you can switch between the languages effortlessly. You're either in one language mode or you're in another language mode. And every time I would open my laptop to write, it would be in Russian, and I would feel, well, I have to focus on Russian now. What's the point? I want my English to be good. So if I'm focusing in Russian, I'm almost, not practicing English, I'm almost damaging it. And my goal is to learn it really well and to speak it really well. And I had this weird vibes, and I would close it and go write my comic again. Eventually, my thought process became, okay, maybe I just, as I write, I would write something in English. So I would continue. It's literally what I had in my documents. It would be part in Russian, and then there would be a paragraph in English, and then there would be a paragraph in Russian again, and then more and more in English, some dialogues in English. It was a mess, and I was like, what I'm doing? Like, how am I going to edit it? Am I going to translate it later? Am I going to hire someone to translate it? It's just weird. I'm not sure when I'm going. And the weird part is that at this point, my novel was so close to finishing that part 2. Literally 2 chapters left. 2 chapters out of 30 left. And it's not like they were not written, they were half written at this point. It was this weird thing, like, why can't you just finish the book? I couldn't, because I felt like, what's the point? I live in another country. What am I gonna do? I'm working this hard on this book to publish it in the country I'm not even living in. Before, I haven't heard from my readers before, and now I'm gonna not hear from my readers at all. And also because, when I moved to Canada, there was all the problems that I had with Russia. Like, I just didn't want to be there. Almost didn't want to be, not like associated, I didn't want to dabble in Russian culture anymore. I didn't want to be in Russian surrounding anymore. And that meant if I'm working on my novel in Russian, it means I have to do this. And it just felt like, what's the point? I moved to this country that I really loved, and I moved to this country not to be in Russia, but then I have to finish this work that I love, but I have to finish it in Russian and send it back to Russia and have still this connection to Russia, and then never hear from my readers again. It just started making no sense to me to do this. And this is where I realized I cannot continue with the novel anymore, and I have to completely focus on my comic, because I started having readership on my comic. People were invested, people liked it. I went to the Comic-Con, to Fan Expo here in Toronto, and I had my readers come approach me, and it was a fantastic experience. And in the sense, it was the same story, and actually even better, because I got the chance to reread it differently, and I made my story different. It started deviating from the novel just enough to match the vibe that I was going for. And also, as I was working on my comic, I realized that, okay, my mind is not changing that crazy now, that because it was my fear. What if I'm gonna write next part of the story, and again, something in my worldview would change drastically, that the previous part doesn't match. Like, I was afraid of this, teenage to early 20s shift that happens in your brain, but eventually it didn't happen. Like, I realized that, okay, some development kind of completed, more development that is to come is not gonna be that drastic, that I don't want to write the story that I wrote before. Hopefully, I don't know, hopefully, or maybe not, maybe I should develop difficult questions. So I realized this comic thing is really going, and I started being more and more committed to it. And I realized, okay, my story is a comic now. It's like, because in my mind before, like, my story had to have a label of what it is, like what is the most canon format, and it was for the longest part a novel. And now I realized, nope, my story is a comic now. And after this switch happened, I realized, okay, whatever I wrote in a novel form is not gonna happen. it's done. It's something to look back at. It's not gonna be done. And you know, just when I abandoned it, this is where people from Russia started messaging me, like contacted me on, you know, VK, this is kind of Russian Facebook. Some readers, they were like, where is book 2? We're waiting for book 2. I'm such a big fan. What happens? La la la. To a couple of them, I actually just sent the manuscript that, you know, this was missing those 2 chapters. Says, hey, it's pretty rough because it's like a second draft or whatnot, but to take it. But if you want, I'm basically retelling the story. It's not gonna be nothing for the reading part after this. But if you want, there's a comic. It's free online and whatnot. So yeah, this is kind of how it happened. And now my story is a comic, is 100% comic. And there is a story about hiatus that I mentioned in this channel a lot after I started working on my comic. I maybe were like 2.5 chapters in, and then I had a hiatus. I stopped working on it for 2.5 years. After I came back from this hiatus, now I'm really serious about it, and since then I created around 7 chapters, and I'm creating now it's a serious process. I'm super committed. It's my life work. I mean, some part of my life work. I don't know, maybe I will have some more life left after I finish this. But yeah, that's it. This is how I stopped being a writer. This is how I dropped my novel. And yeah, maybe I should make a video, and you know, I kind of want to make a video because I think it's interesting, the differences between my novel and the comic, what kind of changed plot wise, and maybe I can give examples of the current chapters that I'm currently drawing, because it's deviated greatly. It's actually funny, it's at some points it deviated greatly, but then it will come back oddly to weird points. I don't even know how to explain it, but the main things stay the same. Which characters, which role they're playing, and which characters' purposes. Wait, it's not English. See, that's why I didn't write a novel in English, because my English is not as great yet. Basically, character roles, they stayed the same. Kinda, my story doesn't have antagonists and doesn't really have like like a protagonist, like a hero and a villain. Doesn't have that. It's just you get to be in the heads of different people and see how they try to make the best choices for themselves and for people around them. That's the story of how I ditched my novel, and yeah, sometimes I miss writing, and I'm hoping when my English gets to a better level, to the level of a writer, which I hope it will get there soon, I want to continue writing and become a writer and write in English, but not on the Book of Contradictions. I have a couple short stories, not like short stories, kids fiction type of thing that I want to write, standalones and whatnot. We shall see how it goes. I have plans, I have thoughts. Yeah, that's it for this video. A little chatty, a little story timey, but let me know if something like this is interesting in the comments down below, or if you have story of your own. Also, this section is for you to talk and for me to talk back. So thank you so much guys for watching. I hope you're having a great week, a great day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks so much guys.